Well, hello, everybody. Welcome virtually to McNally Jackson. We are so thrilled to be launching this book that is very timely, but also very timeless and speaks about a lot of themes that people don't talk about, and in a really beautiful and poetic way, which is exactly the kind of book that we love as booksellers and we love talking about. So we're very thrilled to be doing this today. Before I pass over to everyone, I'm going to make some quick introductions, although I imagine they are not necessary. Before I do that, a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to have some readings tonight and have some conversation, and then after that, there is going to be time for questions. So at around sort of 7:30, the Q&A is going to start. So drop any questions you have into the Zoom chat, and we will definitely try to get to them. All right, so let's get on to these introductions. So Natalie Eve Garrett is an artist and writer. She's the editor of Eat Joy, Stories and Comfort Food from 31 Celebrated Writers, and the Artist and Writers Cookbook, a collection of stories with recipes. A graduate of Yale University and the University of Pennsylvania School of Design, Natalie lives with her husband and daughter and son in a town outside DC. And she's joined tonight by some of the wonderful contributors to this book. Maya Shanbhag Lang is the author of What We Carry, a memoir, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and Amazon Best Book of 2020. She's the author of The 16th of June. She holds a PhD in comparative literature and lives with her daughter just outside of New York City. Emily Raboteau is the author of The Professor's Daughter, a novel, and Searching for Zion, winner of an American Book Award. She teaches creative writing at the City College of New York, and her next book, Caution, Lessons in Survival, is forthcoming from Holt. Claire Dederer is the author of two critically acclaimed memoirs, Love and Trouble and Poser, which was a New York Times bestseller. Dederer is at work on Monsters, a nonfiction book investigating good art made by bad people, coming April 2023 from Knopf. The book is based on her viral 2017 essay for the Paris Review, What Do We Do with the Art of Monstrous Men? She's a longtime contributor to the New York Times. Her essays, criticism, and reviews have also appeared in The Atlantic, The Nation, Vogue, Slate, and many other publications. So Natalie, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, McNally Jackson, for hosting us. So The Lonely Stories began with a question inspired by Roscoe's Book of Delights. And he writes, what if we joined our sorrows? What if that is joy? So while working on The Lonely Stories, I kind of reframed that in my mind as, what if we joined our loneliness? And what if that is joy? When I was a child, I spent a lot of time alone. I was often sick with chronic sinus infections. I had undiagnosed migraines and chronic fatigue syndrome back when that didn't have a name, and anxiety. And as a result, I strongly relate to and empathize with the loneliness of isolation. But at the same time, for me, all that alone time was both, a source of pain and loneliness, but also kind of a wellspring of creativity. And now, as an adult, and as an artist and writer, I find that I really seek out and cherish that alone time, and even feel its absence when it isn't there, which was the case during the pandemic. So I really love the idea of conjuring a book that would kind of tease out the ways in which alone time can be both maddening and joyful. So The Lonely Stories, it's 22 personal essays from celebrated writers illuminating the experience of being alone. I embarked on it before the pandemic. So it's not a pandemic book in the sense that it was born beforehand, and much of it explores kinds of loneliness that existed long before and will continue to echo long after, the pandemic's aftermath. But much of it was written during the pandemic. And for me, after living through a period of such intense isolation, the book really resonates so much more strongly. And kind of the healing from the book that I've experienced feels even more kind of urgent. So I really hope that the reader finds these stories as kind of transporting and unlonely as I do. And with that, I would love if you each might read a bit from your essays. You know.
Natalie, who would you like to start?
Whoever would love to dive in. I'd love to hear them all. Any.
Well, I'll begin
like
just to start somewhere.
Perfect. Please do.
Sure. So my essay is about the period of time when I was caregiving for my mother. In the mornings, I place a small white pill in the palm of my mother's hand. The pill is Aricept, the leading Alzheimer's medication. Just a few years ago, my mother ran clinical trials for Aricept. Back then, she would have rattled off its chemical structure and contraindications, and I would have been filled with pride for her. Newly divorced at 55 years old, she reinvented herself as a clinical researcher. She was happier than I'd ever seen her. Back then, I did not know how limited our time was, that soon she would be taking the very medication she helped advance. I did not think to tell her how much I admired her, how grateful I was for her, how glad I was when she divorced my father. As I place the pill in her palm, I want to tell her that she is a formidable scientist, a no-nonsense physician, a force of nature. You are my mother, I want to tell her, though I recognize the words are for my own benefit. How do we negotiate ambiguous loss? My mother is present but absent. I don't know who I'm talking to, if I should fight for her, try to pull her back to me. She doesn't always want to think about who she once was. It's easier for her to be in the moment, untethered, free, to not face the weight of my expectations. Yet for me, those expectations form the repository of who she was. I feel caught between the past and present. She and I are in the same room, but we are in different times. She takes the pill, swallows it. Then she shuffles away, her slippered footfalls offering their quiet hush. And then I just wanted to read from the very end of the essay, and this is after I've moved my mother into assisted living. I think the most oppressive feature of loneliness is the way it limits the imagination, whispering to us that life will never be better, that we are not allowed to envision possibilities. Loneliness chips away at the space we occupy. In my apprehension, I forgot that good outcomes can exist on the other side of uncertainty, that we cannot see the benefits of a new life until we take a leap. The name for this leap is self-love, and others benefit from it in ways we cannot foresee. Weeks later, I find myself one afternoon stepping into my backyard. The wisteria has started to bloom, climbing up the side of the house in its wild purple reach. I turn my face up to the sky. It is a glorious day, the sky a brilliant blue. This is what my mother would have wanted for me, to stand in the light. I know now that when we let go, we do not lose. For in the act of letting go, we find ourselves, come back to ourselves. And this reunion is joyous, exceeding what we once dared imagine.
Can I go next?
Please.
Thank you, Maya. I just wanted to share that I lost my father this fall to the same disease. And when I read your essay, it made me feel less alone, which I think was Natalie's whole point. So thank you for writing with such vulnerability about your loss. In particular, I love the description you have of, being in a different time signature from your mom, like that loneliness of not being, being in the same room, but not in the same time. I just love the way you expressed that. Okay, So I wrote an essay, it's called Exodus 2020 for this anthology, and it's about the loneliness of that I experienced as a city dweller in New York when like half of my apartment building left the city. So I'm gonna read starting from the middle of that essay. And just since I'm not beginning from the beginning, you should know that what you've missed is like a litany of all of the people who left, like the slow exodus of half of my neighbors in the building leaving. Okay. How to describe the particular loneliness of this, of having been jilted along with the metropolis by the loose acquaintances who make up the pattern of a life. On the island of Manhattan, where we live cheek to jowl, there are over 70,000 of us per square mile. My building has 6 stories and 44 units. Some of us are poor, some of us aren't. I know everyone who lives here by sight, if not by name. In particular, I know the other families with children. My kids were born in our apartment. My husband prepared the neighbors above, below, and to either side of us for the animal sounds of my labor by slipping notes under their doors so they wouldn't hear me crying through the walls and worry I was hurt. At times I have thought the building is alive, but of course that is wrong. We who live here make it so. When my firstborn arrived a decade ago, Jay came up from apartment 23 to deliver a baby gift, a little blue elephant. I recognized it a few years later, sitting atop the dresser of R in apartment 32, when I went over to show her how to breastfeed her own baby. I assumed she found it in the basement trashed a treasure nook, where I'd traded it for some hand-me-down toy outgrown by another neighbor's child. Such was the flow of cooperative living and the language of mutual aid. Can I borrow an egg? Can you feed my cat? Your toilet is causing a leak in my ceiling. Here, I made extra. Last Mother's Day, those of us with little kids planted a potted garden in the alleyway where the building's garbage and recycling bins are kept, so there'd be a green space to gather and play. Was that only a year ago? We planted impatiens, hosta, and ferns, plants that would survive the shade of the building next door so that we only enjoyed a narrow strip of sky. We agreed to take turns keeping the garden alive. We bought benches and an outdoor table set with a bright umbrella. We strung solar lights along the concertina wire at the top of the chain link fence. Our kids played hopscotch down there, rode scooters, threw water balloons. This Mother's Day, the death toll in New York was 21,517. By then, the only other kids left in the building were the pre-teenagers, H and K, whose mother, I, took up smoking again after losing her job as an importer of Turkish bedsheets. She stopped riding the elevator with us because it wasn't possible to socially distance in that box. But sometimes, when I threw out the trash, I'd catch her in the untended garden, furtively stubbing out a cigarette in one of the dirt-filled pots. One time she asked me if I wanted to buy a kid's bike. It was too small for H and K, but maybe for one of my boys? Under normal circumstances, she would have gifted me the bike, she said, but now they needed the money. She quoted her price, and I bought it on the spot. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'll jump in. Thank you both for those readings. It's wonderful to hear them in your voices. And I just wanted to say congratulations again to Natalie on her publication day. It's a great achievement. It's a really beautiful book. I wrote for this anthology an essay called Javelinas, and it was about a period I spent at a residency in Marfa, Texas. At the time, I was a mom and a wife and a family person, and I had gone off to live alone in a little house in the high desert and try to write for many weeks. It was a long residency. And it's a braided essay. It brings together the themes of Texas, the animal, the javelina, the devil card in the tarot, and above all, drinking and not drinking. So I'm going to read briefly from the center of the essay. Aloneness was a posture I was adopting, a crouch I was dropping into. I stopped calling my husband. When I finally did call him, after an unconscionable number of days, he said,
I guess you're turning into a lonely cowboy poet. I hope you're happy. What neither of us said. I'd been alone for years. Pouring glass after glass of wine is the most alone thing you can do. My life was full to the brim, and yet in the midst of it, I just wanted to be left alone with my bottle of Malbec. A lonely cowboy poet. It didn't sound so terrible to me. I wanted to be someone different, someone who had nothing. That sounded like freedom. A year after my time in Marfa, my husband and I read a news story about a woman in a suburb north of Seattle who died of exposure in her front yard during a snowstorm. She was found under a bush just a few yards from the house. My husband wondered, how could this have happened? But I knew exactly how it could happen. It was easy to imagine wandering out of my house, wanting only to get away from everyone so I could be drunk in peace. Once I'd seen the first javelina, I began to see them everywhere. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a scuttling movement on a quiet street end, a hairy rump disappearing behind a shrub. Outside my house grew a luxuriant prickly pear cactus. When I examined it closely, I saw that its spiky petals had cartoonish bites taken out of them, bite marks just the size of a javelina's mouth. One beautiful balmy night, I furtively looked up the liquor store hours on Google and climbed into my car. I drove under high starry skies down San Antonio Street, past the Dairy Queen, past Porter's to Celebration Liquor. I entered nervously, knowing I was stepping into dangerous territory. It's not that I had never drunk bourbon before. I'd drunk literal gallons of bourbon in my life. It was just that I'd never drunk bourbon alone in a house where I was going to be, I'd never drunk bourbon in a house where I was going to be alone for days and weeks. I knew what would happen. The bottle would start to glow at me from the cupboard. It would glow until its light was the only thing I could see in the house. The guy working the register was what my friends and I have always called a hesher, a white rocker dude. I vibrated with shame as I set my bourbon on the counter and paid the hesher with his knit cap and his tattoos. How could I convince him I was respectable? I wanted to tell him about my walks, my healthy dinners, all the writing I was getting done. A gang of javelinas liked to hang out at the slightly dilapidated playground down the street. They glanced over with interest when I passed. I sped up and hoped they wouldn't spring one of their ill-conceived, pointless attacks on me. I looked up some javelina videos. Apparently they ran amok on the streets of Tucson. I felt an atavistic terror when I saw one. They seemed positively satanic. But in Tucson, they were considered mere suburban blight, not such a big deal. Javelinas, not a big deal for the citizens of Tucson, Arizona. Why did the small deals all feel like big deals to me? The javelinas seemed to be coming nearer to my house. I thought I smelled something musky and rotten from my bedroom window. I wrote jokingly to a friend that if she didn't hear from me again, it would be because a javelina had come to my door, swooped me up, and carried me away, officer and a gentleman style. I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so amazing to me because I've read all of these so many times, and hearing you read them, I feel like not only like completely riveted and also strangely like transported through space, like time and space, which with each of them, because they're each so specifically located and have such an environment that's so vivid. But I also feel like I've never read them before almost, or like I really felt like I was trying to not cry like half the time. If this had been in person, you would have been like, Natalie, oh my gosh. It was very emotional. And I mean, I know these essays, but it was just really incredible for me to hear it. Because I've read it so many times, but just in my voice, I think. I've never heard it in yours and with all of the emotion that you felt when writing it, like in your voice. So thank you. I'd really love to hear from each of you what your reaction was when you first received the invitation from me, because that's something I of course I have no way of knowing because I was on the other end and I heard, I mean, we may have corresponded about ideas a bit with, I think at least one of you, we corresponded a bit about that, but then all of a sudden, here was this essay. And I'm just so curious because I think I wrote all of you in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And I wonder, what was it like to get an invitation to consider loneliness or aloneness, or solitude, during a pandemic, during 2020, or just even at all, if I sent it to you before the pandemic, and I may have written some of you a bit before, like in January 2020, for example. And I'm curious if you knew what you wanted to write about immediately, or if it changed and why.
I'll start. I received your invitation to participate in this anthology on loneliness several months before the pandemic. And we had a little back and forth about what I might write about.
Yeah.
And I remember at first thinking I would undertake it by, or approach it by writing about the loneliness of like how lonely you can feel when you're advocating for your special needs child.
Yes.
To receive
and I was so excited about that essay.
Yeah. It's something that that Natalie and I share is parenting children with special needs, and the particular loneliness of trying to make sure that they have all of the supports they need can feel very lonely. And that's what I had intended to write about. It's something I'd still like to write about, but my focus shifted when the pandemic hit. I felt this strange loneliness of being in a city that remained really full. New York City is a city of 8.5 million people, and like 0.5 million, like a 500,000 people left, which felt like so many, and still there were so many of us there. But in my particular building, because we were all stuck in the spring of 2020 in our apartments, like the cells of our apartments, except to leave to go get food basically for a couple of weeks there, I felt really acutely aware of like certain silences. So for example, in my building lived a guy who was part of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. And one of the things I love about living in the same building as that man was getting to hear him practice his instrument. He played the cello. And also we had a piano teacher. And so you would also hear the flights of music from her giving her piano lessons, and suddenly those sounds were gone. And the sounds that replaced it were really terrifying sounds, namely the sounds of ambulance sirens all the time. So I was really aware of the people who left, even though it was still a crowded city. It felt like isolation and solitude in a new way. And I really appreciated having this assignment to try to describe that feeling and to capture it, because that's no longer, that particular kind of loneliness is no longer. So I'm really glad to have had this assignment and to have chosen to write about that, even as a time capsule of what that moment felt like.
Yeah.
Just to hop onto that. So Emily, part of what you were talking about is something that I think is and has been quite intriguing to me, that loneliness and solitude and company, the way those three kind of circles interact in like the Venn diagram of life. And for me, I remember, so I wrote my essay after I got the request. I thought, okay, what was my loneliest moment in my life? And for me, that experience of being my mother's caregiver, paradoxically, that was when my house was the fullest and the most chaotic. Like, I had a really young child, I had a black lab, I had my mother with her dementia. I was married at the time, I'm no longer married. My house was just like very full in terms of like the number of beings in it, but also, like a really small child and a dementia patient. That's like, each one of those things is like really 6 people, so I was like surrounded by people and needs and things and like appointments and, just stuff. And yet I felt such isolation. And I remember thinking like, what's interesting is that now that I'm divorced and now that my mother's no longer here and on one hand, my house from an outside perspective looking in would seem lonelier, but I feel so much less lonely. I don't feel, I feel kind of the majesty or sovereignty of the state of solitude, which I think is very different than the state of loneliness. And to actually respond to your original question, Natalie, when you emailed me, I remember my first thought was, and you said, the subject of this anthology will be loneliness. I remember thinking, well, how dark are we allowed to go? Or maybe allowed is not the right way of framing that, but I thought like, especially as I think I originally got your request before the pandemic, and then, okay, we're in a pandemic. And I thought like, oh, will it be bad to really go there in the writing and really get dark and really talk about that like incredible isolation and those feelings that creep in of like almost a claustrophobia? And what you reminded me of, what you told me, because I remember we had kind of a back and forth about this. And this is so right. I think when we go there, whether in writing or with one another, and we are vulnerable, the darkness gets illuminated. And suddenly we find comfort and solidarity just in the act of being honest. So I hope that's something that people feel when reading the essays, is less alone.
Thank you.
And yes, that's my favorite May Sarton line, Emily, in the chat.
Yes, I saw that. Likewise.
Just echoing what Emily was saying about Maya's piece. I cared for my father when he was dying this year, and reading your piece was really comforting in that way. And I also loved how Emily's piece kind of folded the shared experience into, it was formally expressed by the way she gave people alphabet letters. I mean, she used their initials, but after a while, it started to turn into this alphabet soup of different initials, and you got this sense of jumbles of people leaving, but also you could imagine yourself into their stories. So I thought that was a really effective way to express connection, even in loneliness. I don't know if it was intended, but I really loved that. So when you wrote to me, I think it was before the pandemic, and I had sort of two things that were going on. One is that I've been working for many years on a piece of a book-length work of criticism, which is a very particular kind of book to write. It's very, it's just language is doing a different thing than it does in this kind of essay. And so I was really excited to be able to do something that was kind of off track from this super goal-oriented kind of writing I was doing, very linear. And I think maybe because I was doing this very linear writing on the one hand, I somehow took more space to be circuitous and explore and to write something that was used more white space, wasn't more evocative. And so there was something about the timing that was really nice for me. I felt like I discovered a new way of writing that was sort of anti the other thing I was working on. So a lot of my experience of writing it was more of a craft experience than a subject matter experience. So I was really thrilled to have the space to explore. But then the other thing was, I'd been thinking forever, I'm really obsessed with the musician Graham Parsons. And I had been thinking, he was this hippie, lonely cowboy, cosmic musician in the early 70s who died near Joshua Tree. And I had been thinking about that figure of the lone male in the West and wanting to write about it. It was a really important image to me. And there was a way that I was like, oh, I can use this. I can kind of put myself in his role and see what happens to me as I sort of stride alone across the West. So the piece, even though I don't talk about it, is really informed by a male archetype that I sort of annex and make a, inhabit with my female person. So those were some of the things I was thinking about.
That is so interesting. And now I see your piece in such a, it's illuminated your piece in a way for me. I definitely see that. And I also love how you described the white space, or maybe you said the negative space in your essay, white space. That seems apt. It's so quiet, but it's like, it's a very intense experience reading it, but it also has this kind of hush over it. It's the contrast is very powerful in your essay. I'm also curious if maybe you sort of have touched on this, but if in the process, like if your relationship with solitude or loneliness changed through the writing experience. I don't know if that might be the case or not, or if you thought of it in a different way, or if the pandemic changed your way of thinking about solitude and loneliness, if not the, if you see it differently now. I mean, I know for me, I feel like one thing that I thought about a lot and have been thinking about a lot is, I really found myself both feeling lonely a lot of the time, even though I was quarantining, with my family. My kids weren't in school for a long period, and then they were, doing Zoom school, which kind of still meant that they weren't in school for a long time, and I was both sort of lonely for the world and then also kind of lonely for myself, I think. And something I realized is that sort of yearning for solitude is a kind of loneliness too, because you're disconnected from yourself. But I'm curious, if the pandemic or if the writing experience or either or both changed your way of thinking about it all.
For me, the experience of writing and also the experience of editing this piece with you, Natalie, made me think about my loneliness in that particular chapter of the pandemic differently. Like I really felt very isolated, as others have described, even though I was I had no solitude unless I went into the bathroom and closed the door and turned on the shower and cried. There was nowhere to get away from my children in a 3-room apartment in New York City. But as I was writing this piece and trying to describe that loneliness, I arrived at, in the alphabet of people I was thinking about, the letter N, which was my roommate, Nicole, from college, who was one of the New Yorkers who had the ability to leave the city, owing to the fact that her extended family had a second home in New Jersey. And for her particular family, that was the right choice because she had teenagers and she didn't feel that she was going to be able in New York City to contain them. Like she didn't think she could actually hold on to them. But when I told her I was lonely, I was writing this essay and she said, what are you working on? How are you feeling? How are you doing? And I said, I'm really lonely. I'm writing about the loneliness of being in New York City during the pandemic. And she said, you do not know the meaning of loneliness until you've lived in like suburbia where, we're only leaving every 10 days to go get groceries. And at least you get to walk down a sidewalk sometimes and there are other human beings, but she had nobody but her nuclear family. And so it made me realize just that loneliness is really relative and very particular, and that the way that I was feeling loneliness was something that somebody else who was lonely envied. She altered my perspective on like, okay, so all these people left, but still the beauty of being in a city, part of it, even when you're not talking to the other people, is that there are other people around. Even just the gift of seeing somebody else by the mailboxes or at the bodega was something I was taking for granted as being something that was supporting me and helping me during that time.
Emily, I love what you said about the idea of like people being lonely in different ways, and that being part of loneliness is when you realize like your experience of loneliness and its particular kind of texture or feel, that someone else is like, oh, that isn't loneliness at all. I mean, that compounds loneliness, right? To feel further alienated. And when you describe loneliness for yourself, for me, I remember one kind of astonishing thing that happened for me during this time period. I had always thought of myself as introverted as a writer. And during the pandemic, there was this kind of like, existential kind of wake up call where I thought, wait, I'm like a flaming extrovert, as it turns out, because I had thought like, oh, I will thrive in these conditions. I'm a writer and I was trained as a scholar and I love books, and this will be, I'll like treat this as like a writing residency. And I found that I really missed things that I didn't realize I would miss, like eavesdropping on people, and kind of incidental contact, and being able to like walk around and just like overhear conversations between pedestrians. And it was that stuff that I hadn't thought of as constituting part of a social existence that I really deeply missed. So that was one thing. And the other thing I realized is that despite all of that, writing remains the place where everything is okay. And I think that that was something I knew when I was a kid and an adolescent, but during the pandemic, it was brought home to me in a different way, that it's not just that like I'm my most comfortable or my most safe when I'm writing. It's also that I think there's a kind of strange communion that happens between, it might be, Natalie, your lovely line about feeling lonely for yourself, like maybe it's a chance to reunite with yourself. But I also think there's a strange feeling of the reader who is already, always already kind of there, and you feel them. And that sort of sense of them, I think, is such a lovely thing that transpires in books. And I think there's a pact between authors, writers, and readers that is an almost spiritual thing that is deeply nourishing.
I love that.
Yeah, to kind of jump off that. I mean, I think that I was thinking about my experience through the pandemic, and sometimes crowded, sometimes really solitary. During the pandemic, I got a divorce, sold my house, buried my father, cared for him in the hospital, unvaccinated. It was very crowded at times, kind of dilated and contracted. The one thing that was kind of a shock for me was just, I lost the audience. I lost that compact. I didn't lose it as the audience, I could still read, but as a writer, that kind of constant sense of that person there receiving my voice, maybe because I became so destabilized from all the things I knew, and the world was destabilized, and there was a lot of other destabilization happening. The West Coast was on fire, there were the protests, all this stuff, everything was changing. And something about that thread between me and the imaginary audience kind of melted down for like a year and a half or something. And that was really lonely. I reached for it and I couldn't quite find it. So it was one of those situations where I sort of had to keep going on faith. But in a sense, I didn't know who I was writing to. I didn't have that sense of communion you were talking about. I feel like it came back eventually, but maybe it was just the difficulty. I don't know. I won't pretend to understand.
You didn't have the sense of communion when you were writing this piece, or just
with the reader in general? Even with this piece, I sort of felt like I was throwing things out into a void.
Interesting.
It was a very voidy couple of years.
It was. It was. Yeah. I felt it went back and forth for me. I feel like for me, one of the things that did keep me feel most sort of tethered and most connected was working on this. Honestly, it really, I think I called it a joyful portal in my introduction, and that's really how it felt, like jumping in. I was actually going to ask about the role of solitude in creativity, because I was curious, and I think we have to open it up to questions shortly, but I'm curious is for me creative alone time. I'm a painter as well, and I actually, I have an MFA in painting, and I think of that a lot of the time really is like my first language, and then words are sort of secondary. But when I'm, when I'm in a painting, I mean, I definitely, when I'm really connected and I'm really there and connected to, the form and color, it feels profoundly unlonely, and does feel like a way of creating connection, as you said. But I also feel like even creative alone time for me can feel lonely. Maybe it's just I do sometimes feel that void that Claire, mentioned. I kind of struggle to find the right balance between, I think, feeling connected to others and feeling connected to myself.
I think for me, this is a weird analogy to make, and please forgive the kind of gendered associations with this, but for me, I've often thought of writing in my life as like the mistress. So it's like there's like life doing its thing, to me, with all of the like obligations and expectations and the kind of like ball and chain feeling of like, and then writing comes along in like lacy lingerie and like tempts, it's a portal, to use your word. It tempts me away, or is an escape. And usually writing shows up for me when I have no time for it. And so that was a strange thing during the pandemic, was that I had all the time in the world, and yet life was not doing its thing. Like I didn't have the eavesdropping, I didn't have as much stuff. And so, I think there's also kind of a play between like space and feeling crowded that writing can like seep into in interesting ways. And yeah, I'll leave that there.
Right. Is it time to open it up for questions?
I think it is. We have some questions that have rolled in already, but Natalie, I thought we'd kick things off with, you spoke a little bit earlier about your thoughts on loneliness and sort of how you arrived to this generally, but I'm wondering if we could sort of kick off the questions with, could you tell us a little bit about when you realized that loneliness could make a really interesting theme for an anthology like this, and why the form of an anthology, and so how does this sort of all begin in a more immediate way for you?
Sure. How does it all begin? I in general, I work pretty intuitively. As I mentioned, my background is painting, and I come at making books from kind of visual perspective, and in painting, I was also just a very intuitive painter. I dive in kind of headlong, and then afterwards step back and think, okay, what am I saying here, and what's the message, and why? But first I start with doing, and honestly, I've approached, this is the third collection that I've kind of been diving headlong into, and I've approached them all in the same way. That's how I work. It's just something tugs at my heart, and it keeps tugging, and I follow it and see where it leads. I had the idea in the wake of my last collection, Eat Joy. Eat Joy was a collection of personal stories exploring the dark times in our lives, and the food that helps us make it through. And one thing that kind of struck me while working on the book was just how lonely the dark times in our lives can be, but also kind of how much wisdom and beauty can emerge from darkness. And that was something I just wanted to take a little bit further. I embarked on the Lonely Stories. I think I sold it back in 2019, I think in the end of 2019. And, it was just something that pulled at me. It felt like a hard time to kind of hold on to the idea that there were still stories to tell and joy to be summoned from them. But it really felt, because it was such a hard time for all of this, it felt, I think, for me, more kind of inherently therapeutic to work on it. I hope that somewhat answers.
It does.
Okay.
We have another question here from Mega, which is open up to everyone. What's a craft question that was on your mind as you were writing your essay, or one that you're obsessed with right now? So if anyone wants to jump in, anything, stylistically or craft-wise that's been on your mind.
Thanks for that question, Mega. I'll go first. as has been mentioned, I crafted my essay about loneliness using the alphabet, like thinking about, I mean, I wanted to protect the names of my neighbors. So what began as a way of masking identity also turned into like a structural exercise and thinking about, also thinking architecturally, like when you live in an apartment building with as many apartments as that, and you're talking about that many people, the trick is like how to orchestrate so many folks. And in a small space like an essay, I realized, okay, I don't really have time to paint pictures of these people except for kind of the profession, their apartment number, like the initial of their name, and maybe if they have pets or something, you know. But I've been thinking a lot about, because I'm writing a novel also about living in an apartment building with its huge cast of characters from the perspective of the superintendent of that building. I've been thinking about this structural challenge, like this sort of, how do you craft something that large in a way that the reader can architecturally understand the space and its component parts and its characters. And so on a very small scale with this essay, I was doing what I've been trying to do and thinking about on a larger scale for the novel, which is, how to explain to the reader the relationship between so many people who live together yet apart, how they kind of make an organism, right? Like a mini society together. And I have found that in terms of craft, like I've been thinking a lot about math and architecture in terms of how to structure that concept of cooperative living.
I love that you included the phrase mutual aid in your essay, Emily, that because I was thinking about it as you were writing, and then you just dropped it in, and it was just like, it sort of was like this little axis the essay rotated around for me, like a concept holding it. So anyway, that's an aside. This essay for me was the beginning, I don't know if I want to say of a structural exploration, but it was the beginning to what I feel like is a set of questions that I'm going to be asking as I proceed with my work. And most of the questions that have to do with how can I do less? So I think that in my writing, I have a really strong voice. I have a very, there's a lot of jokes, there's a lot of keeping a lot of balls in the air. And how do I back off? What if what if there's less of me? What if I'm not smart? What if I'm not lovable? What if I'm not all these things? How do I erase the narrative voice more and kind of foreground these images or these moments, which I felt like was something I really had space to explore in this piece. And I feel like it's the beginning of a new way of writing that I want to play with once I'm done with the book length critical work, which I'll be happy to say goodbye to. So that's a short answer, more about voice than craft per se. I guess it's a craft answer.
I absolutely love that, and it reminds me of something one of my favorite painting teachers would talk about. You talk about like creating these islands of clarity, and like he was able to render things to its incredible degree, but he would do that and then he would take away and take away and take away until all that was left was just really all that needed to be there, and the rest, everything else just would go, and islands of clarity were left. I think about that a lot when I'm painting, actually. So I loved hearing that, and I see it in that essay.
Along similar lines, so I've been craft-wise, I've been thinking a lot about, I started off writing decades ago, like my first foray into writing was through poetry. And because of that, so I've been thinking a lot about section breaks and line breaks and page breaks in prose and what they can give to the reader, not just as negative space, but also as resting points and breathing room, and part of what got me thinking about this is Lily King's Writers and Lovers, which is a novel that reads like a memoir. And that first, just that opening couple of pages, she does so much with line breaks versus section breaks versus chapter breaks. And she keeps offering the reader these like safe points to kind of like rest and take in what she's doing. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. Part of that also is that when I wrote What We Carry, I wrote it as I was living it and as I was caring for my mother. And I didn't have the sort of emotional or mental bandwidth for like long narrative. And so I needed the kind of white space and section breaks for myself. And I felt self-conscious about them at the time. And it dawned on me that they can be a gift to the reader. Like if we're struggling with something on the writing end, the reader might need a break or an island as well.
Yeah.
Can I respond to that really quickly?
Yeah,
I'm super interested in white space. I think about it all the time, and I often think of it as this site of participation for the reader. You know, the reader's doing this work to build the transition themselves, but I love the idea of it as a resting space. And I'm thinking about what you said earlier, Maya, about communion. And like, there's sort of these two lonelinesses. This is really pretentious, but meeting in this white space was the image that came into my mind as you were speaking.
I love that.
I love
And
it
I don't
too.
think it's pretentious at all. And also right now, as a side note, in case this is of interest, I'm reading Ruth Ozecki's book right now, The Book of Emptiness and Form, which has all this interplay, but like the book itself talks to the protagonist and the book itself talks to the reader, and the book has a voice, which I think is so interesting. I mean, as we're talking about writers and readers and what happens between us on the page, books are, you know, it's cool to think of them as having their own sort of identity or their own life.
We have one more question. I think it's a lovely note to end on as sort of a rapid fire round. This is from Colleen. So, and perhaps Natalie, you can kick us off. What do you hope that this book shifts regarding people's concept of loneliness?
My hope is that the book might function as kind of a stepping stone to the joy that comes from catharsis. I think, you know, that catharsis kind of comes when we read really resonant, vulnerable stories that we relate to and can connect with, and they're really able to reach us. It's that, you know, that feeling of like, oh, like I'm not the only one. And it sounds like, I love that you read each other's essays in the book, and you have felt a bit of that. You felt a bit less alone. And I think in that way, I know it might have sounded like a leap to say, you know, I started out with Ross Gay, and what if that is a joy? But I feel like the book for me kind of does make that leap. And I mean, there's a stepping stone along the way. And I think the catharsis is the necessary piece, the jump that you make. So I really hope that the stories do that and kind of tilt us towards empathy.
I love that. Claire, maybe you want to go now?
Sure. So I love that. I think what I would want to have people take away is this idea that you're not going to find what you think you're going to find in your loneliness. You're going into this room and it appears to be empty, but there's something there and you don't know what it's going to be. The last thing on earth I ever thought I would find in my loneliness would be sobriety. I wasn't looking for it. I thought the room was empty and there was this thing in there with me. And because I was alone, I had to confront it and I found it. So these unexpected things that loneliness holds is what I would speak to.
Fascinating. Emily, would you like to go next?
Yes, I think there's a I don't want to say that loneliness is pathologized in the culture, but I think there's a lot of shame around it.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the gifts that Natalie has given us in building this anthology around so many writers with different perspectives and experiences who are, sharing, really working through and sharing and being vulnerable about times when we were lonely, that it makes it feel less shameful.
I agree. And Maya, maybe you can close us out.
Yeah, I mean, I think one sort of fascinating aspect of the time we live in is that and I'm not the first person to say this, but we're more connected than ever, social media, et cetera. And paradoxically, we often feel more alone than ever. And I think with social media, there's often this kind of like competitive sport of like, how much can you cover over loneliness, or how much can you put up veneers, and how much can you kind of spackle over all of the messy parts of life. And what I think we've found and are still finding is that when we do that, when we throw up the veneers and the spackle and make it all look okay, that doesn't actually comfort us or make us feel better. And so I think in contrast to that, I think my hope is that if we can learn to kind of practice radical honesty more, that in doing that, we will find not only the liberation of that, but also the camaraderie and the, ultimately, I think there's an empowering thing that happens when we just are transparent and we put out there the darkest thing that we think we can't possibly say. That turns out, I think, to be the most necessary thing that other people need to hear and that we ourselves need to say.
I completely agree. I feel like, being ashamed of loneliness is just, being lonely is enough. And then being ashamed of the loneliness, it's so burdensome. And I feel like making peace with it is so profoundly unlonely.
It's a lovely note to end on. Thank you so much, Natalie and Maya and Emily and Claire, for being here tonight, and congratulations on such a wonderful anthology. And thank you to everyone who joined us and for your wonderful questions. The book is in our stores and it is on our website. So if you haven't already, I really encourage you to check it out. And thank you again. The endings of these meetings are always very abrupt and horrible, so I apologize in advance for having to do it, but thank you so much, everyone, and congratulations again.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.